Hello, and welcome to the recap of our Young Adults Bible Study. This video series that I'm about to begin today and on for the next couple of weeks is an opportunity for the people in our Young Adults Bible Study group, which meets on Sunday nights, to keep up with our series. We're currently studying the book of Revelation, and that book is one that many people are intrigued about but are scared to embark on due to all sorts of issues that we're going to get into as we go. I'm going to be leading this Bible study on Sunday nights. And this is an opportunity for you, if you're a young adult in my young adults group, to keep up with the message and keep up with the study in case you have to miss a day. I'm going to make this video public, so if you're watching this and you're not part of our young adults group, welcome. I hope you enjoy this. Just be aware as you go through these videos that this is not an exhaustive study. This is a recap of the study we're doing on our Sunday nights. Meaning that if you want the full experience of this study, you need to attend a Sunday night young adults group at my home. You're welcome to do that if you live in central Alberta or in the area visiting one day. Otherwise, please feel free to follow along. And if you have questions, which I'm sure there will be because of the amount of recap and the lack of detail I'm going to be going into, please feel free to ask in the comments. I would be happy to engage with you there, and I'll do my best to take part in discussion in the comments, so long as it's respectful and on topic. Otherwise, please feel free to come along for the ride as we go through the book of Revelation. I'd like to also point out the context of this, that this is intended to be a recap of the book of Revelation, and specifically a recap of the study that we're doing on Sundays. Which means that there will not be a significant amount of editing and cutting to this YouTube series. I'm not here to make a YouTube channel for some reason. I won't be doing a whole bunch of editing and cutting and jump cutting, so I just would appreciate your patience and understanding as I and ah my way through this. Thank you for that. Alright, let's get right into it. The beginning of our study on Revelation, the first week that we did this, we began with a specific look at how we understand the Bible. So not just the book of Revelation, but the whole Bible. One of my primary sources for this is I use this book. It's a really great book by Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. Highly recommend that book if you are looking for opportunities to get into reading the Bible. Highly recommend that one. There's a lot of other great books out there as well that I have read, purchased, have on my bookshelf, used in Bible school. And so I have a fairly wide selection. However, this is probably one of the most clear and well put together books on how we read the Bible. So in the process of reading the Bible, we practice something called biblical hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the idea of how we interpret and apply a concept or a text. So when we do biblical hermeneutics, we're looking at how we interpret and apply the biblical text. In this case, we're looking specifically at Revelation, which is great. But we need to understand how we read the whole Bible, and Revelation specifically has over 254 references to the Old Testament. It also references other books in the New Testament, such as John's own writings, and some of Jesus' teachings that we see in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so we need to be aware of the biblical text in its original meaning, and what its point was. And we need to have a good hermeneutic of the whole Bible, and not simply one book. So hermeneutics requires us to look into two major things, interpretation and application. And they need to be done in a specific order. The first is interpretation. Interpretation asks the question, what did it mean? What did it mean? Past tense. For the original author, readers, and writers of the text. What did it mean for the original hearers as the church gathered around to hear the letter of Paul read aloud to their congregation? What did they understand? What was the message they received in their context from Paul, who was writing specifically to them? What did it mean? Once we understand that, we can look at application, which asks the question, what does it mean today? So what did it mean? What does it mean today? Application takes our interpretation, takes the meaning that was intended to the original hearers, the original author, the original reader. We take that meaning and where applicable, where necessary, where possible, we translate that into today's context and apply it to our lives here. The mistake many people make in reading their Bible is that they take what they think it could mean to them today and call that the interpretation. We take the application and we push it into the Bible and say, that's what that has always meant. But that's not what it has always meant. So we need to be very careful in the order of operation. Interpretation, then application. One of my profs in Bible school was often heard saying, and you'll find this in some hermeneutic books as well, that there's only one correct interpretation, but there are multiple applications. So we need to be aware that the correct interpretation is that in which the original writer and hearers meant. So what the writer meant and what the hearers understood. That's the correct interpretation. But there are many applications because there's so many contexts in which it is read and so many contexts in which it can be applied that alter the way in which it is applied, and yet the interpretation should not change. So we need to understand that. This brings us into the topic of exegesis and eisegesis. See, exegesis is a term that means to draw out. And so exegesis is the drawing out of the meaning of the text. So when we read the biblical text, we want to make sure that we're drawing the meaning out of the text. Eisegesis is the idea of pushing a meaning into it. It's coming into the text with a preconceived idea of what you think it should mean and placing that into the text. This shows up commonly in today's theology. Many people, even well-educated biblical teachers, practice eisegesis, where they have a desired intent for the text and they push it in to the text. An example of this might be someone who believes that blessings are financial, that God's blessings are going to be financial. And so then they go into the text, and everywhere that they read anything about blessing, they are pushing into the text the idea that it must be a financial blessing, and that therefore all blessings are financial. And as a result, we get a prosperity message, that God's desire for us is to be wealthy and healthy. This is, of course, a false teaching, one that is denounced strongly in the Bible. Easiest place to find a denouncement of that is 1 Timothy 6. Another great way to see the denouncing of that even prior to the New Testament is in the command to not covet, which is a command about being content in what you have rather than desiring that which belongs to another person. And so we see that the Bible is not telling us that blessings or that faith and God equal financial wealth or physical health. And yet many people push that meaning into the text. So the process of eisegesis, through our current cultural setting where we exist in a consumeristic culture, we push that idea and that context into the text where it does not belong. So we need to be aware of eisegesis, and we need to be practicing exegesis. What is that original intent? What is the text saying on its own? There are three major barriers to understanding the text well, to understanding biblical text and doing good hermeneutics. There's many barriers, but the three that I want to focus on are the three that I think are the biggest. The first is bias. Every one of us carries a bias. We have prejudices, presuppositions, predispositions towards certain things. We exist in a specific place and culture, each of us individually, that allow us to see the text in a specific way that is unique possibly to us and very different from the original hearers. We need to be aware of our presupposition and our prejudice. We need to be aware of it. We can never do away with it fully. There will always be some level of bias. This isn't bad or evil or wrong. It's just reality of the human condition. But we need to be aware of the bias, so that as we enter into the biblical text and we work to exegete, we can ask the question of our exegesis, of our work, of our interpretation. We can ask, is this my bias speaking, or is this actually the text? We need to do that at every step of the process. The second major barrier that we face is the time barrier, the temporal barrier. We are more than 2,000 years removed from the New Testament, or I guess we are about 2,000 years removed from the New Testament. We are more than that from the Old Testament. Some portions of the Old Testament we may be 5,000 or 6,000 years removed from. That is a huge amount of time. We have gone through massive cultural changes From the Roman Empire to the British Empire to civil wars to massive transformations in theology and concept, from orthodox catechisms to great movements of radical reformation and Protestant separation. We have experienced the discovery of whole new continents. We have moved into industrial eras, world wars, and now the technological era. We live in a millennial generation, one that is seeking various forms of truth and reality and identity, who no longer accept the concept of absolutes, who operate more in the concept of tension. We have so much shifted in our culture from 2,000 years ago that we must be aware that what we read in the biblical text was not meant for this culture. There are absolutely applications, but John did not live in North America. John did not live in a democratic country. John did not have a president that was voted for. We need to be aware of the context. We need to be aware of the 2,000 years that separates us. We must have an eye on history while we study the text of our Bibles. Our third major barrier is language. Many of you watching this and taking part in my young adult study have not studied the Greek or the Hebrew of the Bible, and neither have I, honestly. I have very little knowledge of the Greek in the Bible. I have a bit here and there that I picked up through my years in seminary, and yet I never took a Greek course or a Hebrew course. I mean, in hindsight, that would have been a good idea for usefulness. Unfortunately, I took most of my courses while in an internship and was off campus, so I felt it was very difficult. That's a side thing. Let's just move on from that. I did not study Greek or Hebrew. I may again one day, but I did not, and many of you did not either. As a result, we have a language barrier. So most of us are going to be operating off of an English translation of the Bible, which is totally fine. But we need to be aware of translation philosophy and methodology. Methodology is probably the better word. We need to be aware of translation methodology. So let me just quickly oversimplify translation methodology. This is very simplified. There's two major approaches to how we translate a text. So the first is the literal translation, where we take the Greek or the Hebrew and we translate it into a word-for-word translation. We take it directly from the Hebrew and put it into the English, directly from the Greek and put it into the English, and we use, as much as we can, we try to go word for word. So this would result in us getting things like, in the Old Testament, there's a line that says in the Hebrew, if we were to translate word for word, it says that Abraham had a long nose. Abraham was long-nosed. And in very old versions of the King James, it still uses that phrasing. However, the cultural context, as far as we can tell, is that long of nose refers to patience. And so this was a slang statement that referred to his patience. If Abraham has a long nose, it means that he is one of long suffering, which we also see in the King James' later translations. And today we use the term patient. And so we need to be aware of the word for word. The literal translation gives us a more accurate picture of the intended words chosen. And yet it sometimes hinders us because of our cultural and temporal barrier. So we need to be aware of that. The other way in which we translate the text is the liberal translation. And this is where we take, or the free translation, or the thought-for-thought translation, which is where we take the intent of the author, the intent of the sentence that is being spoken, and we translate it into a common English sentence. So we would take something like a phrase that says Abraham has a long nose, we translate that into English language that the common human would understand, the common English-speaking North American would understand. And now if we were writing this for a Japanese culture, then we would translate it into as much as accurate the Japanese understanding in common Japanese language. Right? So we translate into the common language of the people that we're writing the translation for. So Abraham is long of nose, we would just quickly translate that to Abraham is patient. And so recognizing the thought-for-thought versus the word-for-word translation is an important process of understanding the Bible. Many versions of the Bible and translators operate on a methodology of the functional equivalent. They attempt to balance the two approaches in order to create a more dynamic an accurate and full picture of the biblical text. I personally prefer to use the NIV, the New International Version, because it is pretty much dead in the middle of the two approaches. But I also contrast it very often with the ESV, which is a more word-for-word literal translation. And I tend to contrast that a little bit with the NLT, the New Living Translation, which is a largely thought-for-thought translation, allowing me to get a more full picture of the biblical text. And hopefully from that, I can get a more accurate and clear interpretation of it. Of course, if you're able to, the most accurate translation you can read is probably the Greek. So if you can read it in the Greek, you're going to get a more accurate picture of the biblical text. And I highly recommend that if you're able to. But if you're not, ESV, NIV, NLT, CSB, NASB, any of those are great versions of the Bible. And if you're doing a full in-depth study, I'd recommend using 2 or 3 of them at least and contrasting the text where necessary. And just looking for a nice full picture. Okay, so those are the basics to interpreting. We're going to try to come into our book of Revelation from that perspective. The idea of interpreting the text, drawing out its meaning. What did it mean for the first readers and hearers and author? And then after that, we're going to look at how does that then apply for us today? What does that mean to us today? And does it mean anything to us today at all? So we want to make sure that we're coming at that from the right angle. So thanks for following along so far. I'm going to take a quick break here. I may just do a jump cut. I'm not really sure. But right here, we're just going to take a quick break, and I'll get into Revelation chapter 1. If you have not yet read Revelation chapter 1, please do so before watching the next part of this video. And make sure that you take a good thorough read through Revelation 1. I'd even recommend reading it out loud. And the reason for that is because of the first line in there. And just in general, it's meant to be read aloud. These letters were meant to be done that way. But read it aloud. And recognize that blessed are those who read the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it. So read aloud. Get a good feel for the book of Revelation. Read Revelation chapter 1 before the next part of this video, please. As we head in, I'm not going to read it in the video, so just be aware of what you've got. I'd even recommend having your Bible open in front of you as we delve in.